All right, well, welcome everyone and good morning. We're going to go ahead and kick off our program. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I am the Deputy Executive Director of the Minnesota Housing Partnership, MHP, and we're pleased to have a discussion today and present some of the findings and recommendations from our recent report titled A Better Building Code, Recommendations for Increasing Housing Resilience and Racial Equity for Minnesota Renters. And just a quick introduction of MHP. Can you go back a slide? We are an organization that's a 30+ year nonprofit. We produce data-informed research. We advocate for equitable housing policy and provide community development services across the United States, specifically serving rural communities and Native nations. Next slide. So this report was a collaborative effort with several other organizations that we will introduce later on in the program. It examines the impacts of an advanced building code. We examined some data, we incorporated interviews to deepen perspective, and we synthesized research to develop findings and recommendations. Our recommendations range from how to target resources where they are needed most to implementation recommendations and more. Next slide. So for today, we will be utilizing some panel conversations to dig deeper into our recommendations and findings. And so you will be able to learn a bit more about some of the items that have just been flashing before you on the screen. We'll also be putting some of our report summaries into the chat so they're easier for you to access. And to start off, I'm turning things over to our research manager for MHP, Gabriela Norton. Gabriela.
Sorry, the mute button. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Gabriela Norton. I'm the research manager for MHP. And you can go to the next slide. So I'll be starting off with some background about multifamily properties and renter households. In structuring the data analysis of this report, we wanted to better understand both the people living in and the housing characteristics of these 4+ story multifamily buildings, which would be those impacted by the implementation of the Better Building Code. Areas zoned for multifamily housing are just slivers of total housing zones. And research on zoning throughout Minnesota shows that areas that allow much higher density are a small portion of land use in the state. And also that households of color are much more likely to live in those multifamily zoned areas compared to white households. Next slide. Some additional key facts about renter households. Minnesotans have been experiencing housing crises that have just been heightened by COVID-19. The pre-existing inequities in our state in housing, which includes housing instability, housing cost burden, and the health cost of poor housing quality, have greatly deepened since the pandemic, particularly for BIPOC and low-income renter households. Additionally, over 100,000 of Minnesota's low-income residents or households that earn under 30% of AMI, which equates roughly to $27,950 for a family of 4, do not have housing that is available or affordable to them, which forces people into unsafe and unstable housing situations and homelessness. Next slide. So some key housing facts continued. There is a severe discrepancy between market supply and market demand for housing, as illustrated in this chart on this PowerPoint. Of the approximately 8,800 rental units constructed each year, almost all are affordable to people making more than 80% of area median income, which translates to about a family of 4 earning $74,500. Meanwhile, there's exceeding need for rental units available and accessible for both extremely low income households, households earning 30% of AMI, and also for very low income households or households earning under 50%. So you can see this mismatch illustrated in this chart here. Next slide. Some terms when we're talking about what is affordable. So we consider housing affordable when a household does not have to spend over 30% of their income on rent or mortgage and utilities. We define cost burden as households that are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And then additionally, severe cost burden occurs when households are paying over half of their income on housing. Next slide. So cost burden is present in every part of our state, as you can see illustrated in this map. It occurs in every county. Overall, 43% of Minnesota renters experience cost burden. So that's roughly 286,784 renters who are cost burden. This often means they may need to sacrifice other things, other necessities such as food or medicine or transportation, childcare, etc. Additionally, housing costs have increased disproportionately to median renter income. From 2000 to 2019, the median renter income in Minnesota increased by just 1% after adjusting for inflation, while median gross rent increased by 14%. Next slide. So this cost burden also disproportionately affects BIPOC households and low-income households. The disparities heighten when looking at race, even disaggregated from total BIPOC households. So you see here 44% of white renters in Minnesota experience cost burden compared to 58% of Black renters who are paying more than they can afford on housing in Minnesota. Next slide. So when looking kind of at the housing characteristics, some frequently used terms that we're using when we use affordable properties, we're referencing properties with income affordability restrictions, usually due to receipt of a public subsidy. And for the universe that we were analyzing, our source is CoStar, a commercial real estate database that tracks multifamily properties with 4 or more units. Next slide. So here I mapped out multifamily properties that have 4 or more stories around the state. The map in orange on the left indicates properties that have subsidy or are a mixed unit. And then the map on the right with green indicates market rate. So you can see there are certainly clusters in the metro area, but when you look more at the mixed and affordable properties, there are, more properties present in greater Minnesota. So in total, 40% of multifamily affordable homes or units are located in properties with 4+ stories. And that compares to a smaller percent, 22% of market rate multifamily units are located in these same buildings. Additionally, as I mentioned, when you separate out the 7-county metro to Greater Min, Greater Min has a higher proportion at 42% of 4+ story buildings that are affordable or have subsidy. Additionally, there are several counties that are home to these 4+ multi-story buildings that would be impacted by the implementation of the Better Building Code that also have very high rates of present housing cost burden and also high rates of energy burden households. And that leads to our next slide. So when looking at energy burden is defined as paying over 6%. That would be defined as high energy burden. Paying over 10% of your income is considered severe energy burden. And low wealth households and communities of color disproportionately face higher energy burdens. In Minnesota, the average Minnesotan will pay 2% for their energy burden, yet Minnesota's lowest income households pay 13% of income. And this map here indicates the number of households that are experiencing severe energy burden. And then moving on to my last slide, in the report, we also included community snapshots. We wanted to identify 3 areas of multifamily housing to kind of bring to life how to better understand the people who might be impacted. So we selected properties and identified demographic trends within a 2-mile radius for these 3 categories of properties. The first one being naturally occurring affordable housing. So NOAA properties with 4+ stories. NOAA properties are market rate properties with rents affordable to those earning under 60% of area median income, and the rent is subject to change by owner. We also included new construction market rate housing, and then finally subsidized housing that has undergone significant renovation. So we have more detailed information about kind of demographic trends and income trends within 2-mile radiuses of those selected properties. And that is it for my data and maps piece.
Thanks very much, Gabriela. Appreciate it. So we are now going to turn to the first of 2 panels that we will facilitate. Our first panel is focused on learning more about some of our qualitative inputs to the report. So in conducting our report, we hosted 3 focus groups with residents that ranged from those with experience as renters, homeowners, and some also had owned properties themselves. And then we conducted a number of interviews with property owners, managers, and developers. These folks who we interviewed and the organizations, they range from nonprofit to for-profit, but all had experience with affordable properties, even though I think all of the for-profit, they all had experience with affordable properties, although most of the for-profits also have experience with market rate properties. And here are some of the themes and the highlights from these interviews and focus groups that then became incorporated into our recommendations. Next slide. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for this first section. We are really pleased to welcome Metric Giles, who is Director of the Community Stabilization Project, Sedia Omar with the New American Development Center, where she works on community engagement, and Chris Sherman, who is the President of Sherman Associates. And we can probably take down our slides and turn to our Q&A here. So welcome panelists, and I think I'm going to start with a question for Sedia. Conducting these focus groups allowed us to really delve into understanding more about that resident perspective, which I think sometimes is not as prominent or front and center. And from helping facilitate these groups in your other experience, how did you come to understand how energy costs and energy issues affect renters, or what is present for them?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for giving me the opportunity to speak here and be representing the community. One of the, well, when we were talking to the group, we've seen a lot of hurdles. You know, one of the cost, you know, high energy costs was making the people to choose either putting food on the table for their kids, or, you know, paying their rents. Also, some of the families that we interviewed was concerning and saying, you know, we know they don't have the resources. They don't have the resources to know how to use the energy, the proper way to use their energy. And also, if they are having a hard time to pay their bills, resources that are out there. There are resources, but they're not aware of it. So they were choosing to pay their bills, instead of buying food for their families or proper clothing for the season.
One just follow up to that is, what kinds of feedback did you hear about health related issues?
I heard some of the kids were developed asthma because there was no proper heating in the house, and the house developed bad conditions, moles and conditions that they cannot leave. Some insects were there too, and that caused one of the kids to have asthma, and they had to move that kid to live with another family members outside of the household.
Thanks for sharing that perspective. I wanted to turn to Chris for our next question. I know, Chris, you've described that Sherman Associates really incorporates energy efficiency into your business model. This is something that you've worked on for many years. And I think one just a big picture question that comes up that we hear from developers and property owners frequently is, what are the feasible ways that multifamily building owners and developers can conserve energy? What advice would you give there? And what do you think would incentivize property owners to do more than they're doing now?
Thank you. And thank you for the time this morning to talk about this very critical subject. Environmental sustainability is fully integrated into our business. Sherman Associates has an ESG policy, a commitment, ESG being environmental sustainability, social impact, and governance. For decades, we've really focused on providing the best energy outcomes, but also really focusing on providing housing that is of high quality for all incomes. So for us, as we look at, what are the more feasible ways that we approach energy efficiency, I really put it into three buckets. Energy efficiency, upgrades and selections that we're able to do without any financial support assistance is a growing list. There's really a growing demand in the private sector to make sure we're making long-term energy decisions in both affordable housing and all housing for that matter. So if it improves our customer satisfaction, that's a huge component for us. And what can we do to better improve our customer satisfaction? Can we reduce our customer utility expense? That's massive for us to really focus on. That is a core subject that we're discussing today. That is a number one item for us in this bucket. Can we reduce the building utility expense? And can we look at some long-term upgrades that are going to provide for some longer-term returns for all the stakeholders involved? So as we look beyond that bucket, it then comes to the tools that are available to us today in the second bucket. And there are a growing list of tools available today for driving decisions to be made on the energy efficiency side. Those include rebates, the rebate programs that we have available to us for appliance upgrades, for LED light fixture upgrades, but they also include local and state support. But beyond that, one of the things that the private sector is starting to really push forward is lower cost financing. With Fannie, Freddie, and HUD, we are able to access lower cost financing if we're achieving certain energy hurdles. So I think as we look at really that bucket, you can start to further explore with existing buildings. Well, there are some options already available that are matching, that we can really say, well, we want to do these long-term improvements, but on their own, they need some support, some subsidy. Well, there already are some tools available, lower cost debt, and there are rebates, and there are other programs that are already available as a matching incentive to really drive outcomes for all stakeholders. And then the third bucket that I think is really the challenge here in the discussion with better building codes are those upgrades that have a cost that exceeds the value of the upgrade plus the incentives available. And that's the one that really we're very focused on closing the gap on, because to be able to provide across all of our housing types for all incomes, more energy efficient outcomes for our customers is a critical focus. And I think from a solution standpoint, I think certainly there's the potential of having more state and local support available, but I would also suggest similar to what we utilize for affordable housing, the lower tax rate on affordable housing, the 4D tax rate, that tax rate becomes an important component consideration for what else we could potentially consider and do to drive better outcomes in alignment to make long-term energy decisions. One of the big focuses that our state has collectively right now is we have a huge shortage of affordable housing. And we have a growing gap between cost-burdened households and households that are in high-quality affordable housing. So I think there's a lot of good tools here that we can utilize on the energy efficiency side that also align with providing more affordable housing globally. So energy efficiency is really number one on our list, and we're really excited to be at the table here coming up with some better long-term solutions.
Thank you, Chris. And I might just add, if there are questions folks have or comments, feel free to utilize the chat. Metric, I wanted to turn with you with maybe a couple things here. I think the first thing I wanted to ask is, or maybe start with a comment, which is that when we started working on this report, one of the impetuses for doing it was an initial race equity impact analysis that one of the cities had done to try to understand impacts of an advanced building code. And so I wanted to ask you, how should we think about incorporating a race equity analysis and into this work here, especially around advanced building codes? And what does that look like?
I'll mute myself here.
There you are, yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity. And I want to thank everyone that's on this call, because this is really a very important conversation that we're having today. And before I can get directly to your question without taking up a lot of time I want to take us back to 1954. Now, I don't know if everyone know what happened in 1954, but it was Brown versus the Board of Education. And they came out of that Brown versus the Board of Education. And with the lack of time, I can't go back into a lot of other history about it, but I would encourage you to look at it. It is separate but equal. And we found out separate schools for Blacks against whites. That was the answer to saying, well, the Blacks cannot live with whites, but we will make sure that their education facilities are separate, but they will be equal. We know that was not true. So as we talk about this conversation today, we're somewhat having the same conversation. We're having a conversation that says that we want to make sure that the multifamily buildings are up with better building codes, but we also need to understand that in the state of Minnesota, in the United States, that there's also a separation there with home ownership and renters. And as we talk about renters today, that 80% of home ownership is Europeans, and that other 80% of people of color, BIPOC communities, were either incarcerated in transition or we're in rental units. So that's why we cannot talk about better building codes, rental multifamily housing without having a racial equity lens, because that's where we are. So the other piece I want to really say that we also have to have a baseline that we have integrated intersectional systems, because just building better buildings is not the solution either. It has to be very integrated, and it has to be about making it better for the people that are living in there.
Metric, I actually wanted to follow up with what I think might be kind of a good next question, which is that one of the recommendations from the report was about rethinking what decision-making structures may look like, and ensuring that there's equitable representation among those decision-making structures. Can you talk a little bit more about what that recommendation was getting at, and how we should think about that?
So one, I want to say the people we interviewed, they were just overjoyed that they was even being included in the conversations that we had. And we actually made a promise that I'm hoping that we can keep. That we said, one, we aren't going to do what people normally do, just come out to you, have a conversation, and then just kind of like suck up your energy, check off that we talked to you. That we're actually going to try to say that there has to be equitable representation. If we're talking about building codes where people are going to be living in, then those people who are living in those buildings need to also have to have a say within those buildings, because within Minnesota, we again know that who we have to start recognizing who are living in the buildings. And I think everyone on this call here will agree with the fact that if something is for them, and if they don't have the opportunity to have some inclusive input in that, it doesn't work for them. So we have to have that as a standard of representation. And that needs to be part of any type of decision, which if we talk about equity, equity is making sure that the most impacted people are included at every level of the process. And that has to become a standard for us.
I'm going to take a little different turn here and turn back to Sedia. One of the other kind of highlights that came out of the focus groups and resident interviews was talking about training and education opportunities, as well as how residents can identify like things inside their place of residence, like appliances, that end up being very front of mind and very health and safety focused. So what are some of the things that you took away from these recommendations that there be more training to incorporate residents?
So I am a renter as well, and then that kind of opened my eyes. Well, you know, as a renter, the landlord will give you a tour of the the apartment that you're going to be moving in, that they don't give out within that tour, you know, how to use the appliances, and, you know, how to keep maybe the window shut during the winter to keep the energy, and ways to, you know, to lower your energy use. And I think landlords should consider that, and, you know, put that within the tour. Hey, if you are moving into this apartment, keep the windows shut. You know, the fridge. You know, I have kids, and my kids do open all the time. You know, be aware of the fridge is working properly, and close the fridge. I use a gas stove. You know, maybe check on the gas stove that's all the way closed up. Something's like that. You know, also like the 15-minute rule. I did not know that. The 15-minute rule. If you're not gonna be in the room, you know that you're not going back to that room in 15 minutes, turn off the light. Things like that, you know, that can lower, small things like that you can lower your energy use. I think that's important for the landlords to incorporate with their tour and their signing, you know, the lease.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to turn back to Chris. This might be the last question we have time for. I'm still keeping an eye on the time here. But when you had brought up a very interesting point, Chris, as an area of particular focus, looking at high-rise buildings of a certain age that have certain systems that are very expensive to replace, and especially affordable properties of that certain age. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your recommendation that that was repeated from some of the other property owners we talked with as well, that we need to target some policy focus on major retrofits.
Absolutely. So I think it's very critical that we develop policy that drives the desired outcomes and does not result in unintended consequences. And I think three of those unintended consequences, and leads into this question here, are the loss of affordable housing, specifically NOAA, which are a lot of those 1960s, 1970s, 1980s high rises, but those high rises are also low income housing properties as well, that need substantial improvements. Another unintended consequence is the slowing of all supply of new multifamily housing. Years from now, 50 from now, what we're producing will and may not occurring affordable housing down the road. And then the third is the negative impact first two on our tax. And the tax is really a tool that we can utilize to help raise the bar, our approach to energy efficiency long term. I mean, if we can grow the tax and have a bigger tool to utilize to tackle one, affordable housing, but whatever you want to place it in the order, energy efficiency, that's going to be a catalyst to allow us to take the next big step forward with the Better Buildings Code. So I think to answer your question, the 1960s, 70s products, a lot of them were built with galvanized plumbing systems. We've done one major replacement project of a galvanized plumbing system over the last 10 years, and that was Riverside Plaza. A lot of these 1960s, 1970s buildings have mechanical systems, have major building systems that are approaching their useful life. And the cost to replace, the cost to reposition the property for the next several generations of people that will live there is substantial. It's a substantial cost, and it's really a substantial opportunity for us in the coming years. I say that because I think we have some of the tools available today to be able to really focus on how we can reposition the properties, this pool of properties for the long term, whether it be the state historic tax credit, pairing with the federal historic tax credit, or the low income tax rate, 40 tax rate, which right now there's discussion on reducing that tax rate, and that can be a tool that can really allow for more private investment to go into the repositioning of these properties. But at the end of the day, what is most important for this large pool of affordable housing units that are in these 1960s, 70s, 80s buildings is that we reposition them physically so they continue to be high quality affordable housing. And I think we have some of the matching tools available to focus on that. But I think what we really want to focus in on as well is that we're not putting in regulation that could inhibit the outcomes. And that can be twofold. One, increasing costs to an extent to where the project is not viable. And then two, having the unintended consequence of if we have an energy efficiency benchmark that needs to be achieved for these major rehabs, is the only way to achieve it to convert a naturally occurring affordable housing property to market rate. And that's not the outcome that we, or really I would say a broad group of stakeholders here want. There's very few that would say I want to convert from affordable to market rate, but sometimes and frequently the last 10 years that's been the occurrence. So I think as we focus on implementing policy here, we really have to focus on that pool of 1960s, 70s, 80s properties, as well as all the new production as well, that we're allowing the Better Building Code to drive really good outcomes for our aging housing inventory and allowing for reinvestment to occur and smart reinvestment that's driving good energy efficiency outcomes, but that we're also on the new production side, allowing for new production to not just continue to move forward at its current rate, but hopefully accelerate, because at the end of the day, we need more supply, and more supply is going to lead to more quality housing, because more supply is going to lead to a bigger tax base, and a larger tax base at the end of the day gives us the tools collectively as a state that we need to continue to focus directly on supporting those that need the most. And direct subsidies a component of this too, and how we can better directly subsidize the energy efficiency upgrades, but I think also directly subsidize the households that are cost burdened. We have 284,000 cost burdened households in Minnesota, and I think collectively we can really close the gap on supporting the cost burdened households in the coming years. And we've got some really good brains at the table that are working on this at the state level, city level, MHP, and everyone on this call. So I'm looking forward to continuing those conversations.
Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to Metric, Sedia, and Chris for sharing some perspectives. I know this is all too short, but I need to pass it on to my co-moderator, Justin Fay of Fresh Energy, to introduce the next panel.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Fay. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a 30-year-old Minnesota-based nonprofit organization working to achieve carbon neutral economies by mid-century. We've been very, very grateful for our partnership and to be in regular dialogue with MHP for many years. And so it's a real privilege to be here joining this conversation this morning. And thank you specifically to Elizabeth for the invitation. We're going to jump right in to our panel discussion today. As with the previous panel, if you have questions or comments, please put those in the Zoom chat. I'm going to try to keep an eye on that as the conversation progresses, and if time allows, we'll work those questions into the discussion. So I'm going to now pivot to introduce to our panelists, and I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves. And as you do so, you each have an opening question I'd like you to answer briefly, and that's simply, why is a better building code an important goal or tool for you in the work that you're doing? And we'll start with Representative Long.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you. I'm Jamie Long. I'm a representative from Southwest Minneapolis, and I chair the Climate and Energy Committee in the House. And I'm really excited about talking about better buildings and building efficiency and what we can do with the state capitol. That's because I think that these conversations around climate, clean energy, energy affordability, and affordable housing have been too often siloed, and I'm really glad that we are bringing those conversations together. I think the previous presentations showed really clearly that energy affordability is a big part of housing affordability, and we know that housing itself and buildings in particular are 40% of our greenhouse gas and energy usage in the state. So there's a lot of reasons to work together, and we had Elizabeth Glidden testify in front of the Climate and Energy Committee just recently on the report, which was fantastic. And I'll be happy to dig into the policy discussion as we go on today.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, Representative. And next is Kim Havey.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Havey. I'm the Director of Sustainability with the City of Minneapolis. And as part of that, we are really working on policies that can promote energy efficiency in both new construction, where we do have a lot of new construction in apartment homes. You know, Minneapolis is nearly 1,000 buildings that are 50,000 square feet or larger, and several hundred of them, around 300 or so, are actually multifamily. So we have one of the biggest impacts that would be felt from a more efficient energy code. And I think it's just so fundamental that we put in place the right policies to support energy efficiency for reasons around carbon, but also reasons around equity, which the report talks a lot about, and the resilience to the different changes in weather as a result of climate change, as well as we've seen that the quality of indoor air and the quality of housing as far as for comfortability leads to healthier well-being, which can make you much more resilient to things such as asthma and COVID. So it's extremely important for the city of Minneapolis to work hand in hand with the state and with others to really set a pathway towards a net zero energy building code. So we have a huge impact from those changes I think they're a very positive impact, affects a lot of our residents, and we'd really like to see that move forward. So it's really important for us to support these efforts. And we've been working with the coalition with Representative Long and also with Russ Stark at St. Paul and other cities to really pursue this more efficient pathway towards energy efficiency and resiliency for all.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And last but not least, Russ Stark.
Good morning, and thanks for having me here this morning. Russ Stark, I'm the Chief Resilience Officer working in Mayor Carter's office in St. Paul. And it's really important to us to work on this Better Building Code issue because we've got a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the community down to 0 by 2050. And in St. Paul, that number that Representative Long cited as being 40% of statewide emissions, in St. Paul, that number is actually over 60% of our emissions come from the energy we use in buildings. And we also know and are concerned about the climate change that we're already experiencing, and that our most vulnerable residents in the city will be hit first and worst by a continuing change in our climate, where we're getting hotter and wetter all the time. We know that we have to get the fossil fuels out of our buildings in the next 25 years. And so better building codes are a really important tool for making sure that we're not adding to a problem that we're going to have to fix in the coming decades. New buildings, in a way, are the easiest place to decarbonize. And then we can get down to the more difficult work of decarbonizing in our existing building stock. So glad to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, thanks so much, all, and thanks for being here this morning. This conversation, this panel is really intended to be focused around solutions. And so the first question is going to be for Representative Long. And it's really just, can you tell us a little bit more about what solutions are being considered at the Minnesota legislature this session?
I'd be happy to. Well, in the very same hearing where Elizabeth Glidden presented the report from MHP, we also heard my bill, which is House File 831, that would be an update to our the way we handle our energy codes for buildings in the state, to allow cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul and many others who are interested in this to move a little bit faster than the state as a whole, and to essentially pilot the new, more efficient energy codes when they can come out at the federal level. So those codes are known as the ASHRAE codes, 90.1, and they are set at the federal level, and then the state is required to adopt them, but it often takes some time for the state to adopt them, up to several years. And so this would allow cities, once those federal codes are out, to go ahead and adopt them themselves, which will keep the alignment with everybody knowing that eventually that code is going to be adopted statewide, since it's already required to be. But it will allow cities to move just a little faster and have several years of buildings that will be at that higher code. So it's an important step, and one that we're really excited about. Had a great hearing on it in the House, and are hoping there will be a hearing on it soon in the Senate. But I also want to mention that's, I think, a solution for the multifamily housing and large 4-story or above structures. But we're also looking at the affordable single-family housing issues and weatherization as well. And so we're making a really big push this year to have state funding for the first time go into weatherization, which targets low-income single-family households and tries to make sure that those households have efficient homes, have good insulation, and that can save hundreds of dollars a year for families that get weatherization assistance. Right now, Wisconsin does 3 times as much weatherization as we do per year in Minnesota, and that's because they put state money into it, and we don't. So that's something we want to fix.
Well, that sounds really great. A lot going on. Keeping up with our theme of solutions, I want to pivot to our local leaders that we have on the panel this morning. And this next question is for you, Kim. What kind of local solutions are Minneapolis currently piloting or considering piloting regarding decarbonizing homes and businesses in your and buildings in your city?
Thank you. Well, we've got a number of different programs that we're starting off slow. So they're similar to a pilot, but in actuality, we plan to continue them on and expand them and scale them up. So we've got both existing and a new construction. We've got a couple of different opportunities. One is that we've created a green cost share program that works with and focuses on collaboration with our properties, our rental properties that are designated as 4D. And that Mr. Sherman had mentioned 4D a number of times, but basically it requires that homes, 60% of the apartments in those apartment buildings remain affordable to families in the city. And in exchange for that, they get a discount over a period of, I believe it's 10 years on the property taxes. So that program's in place as a state program, and we're using that to identify affordable housing properties, the NOAA that we talked about, naturally affordable housing, to be able to come in and work with a combined effort with utility rebates, green cost share for energy efficiency improvements, and support on lead and healthy homes, lead remediation efforts as well. So combining those efforts is one of our really successful things that we've seen in the last couple of years that have had some good effort. We just recently received a $2 million grant from HUD to support combining our efforts around local resources, lead and healthy homes, and weatherization. So we can leverage both our local green cost share and the utility rebates. Now, we've also recently created a pool of funding that can be used to address accessing federal weatherization funds. So if you have, for example, vermiculite in your attic insulation or asbestos wrapped around your boiler pipes, that becomes basically a deferred, as it's referred to, a property and weatherization. If we can address those issues by removing the vermiculite, the asbestos, insulating uninsulated crawl spaces, those homes become eligible for the federal weatherization funds. So we're really trying to look at how we can fill that gap. And then one of the other things that we're doing that we hope we can expand to larger properties, but we have done for a program called Minneapolis Homes, which are support for building affordable properties for families at 60% or below of area median income. They're 1 to 20 unit properties and they're new. So we've added in a program that incentivizes developers making or designing and building homes that are certified as passive homes or net zero energy homes through the Department of Energy. And in 2020, when we started the program, we had 2 homes that received this extra funding. In 2021, we had 17 new single family duplex and townhome style housing being developed to these extremely efficient standards. And these homes are going to be made available to families, like I said, at 60% of area median income. So our goal is to be able to take this kind of program and see how we can expand it out to some of our larger properties, our 4+ unit and larger affordable housing projects as well too. So those are just a couple of examples that we've been doing on programs that could be adapted, I think, for the larger multifamily housing market.
That's great. Thank you. I think we heard a little bit of discussion in the previous panel. Sometimes when we talk about solutions, there can be unintended consequences of those solutions if they're not fully thought through or not implemented with a lot of care. While they often save money in the long run, things like electrification and energy efficiency do require upfront expenses. And so this next question is for Russ. And Russ, it's simply, how is St. Paul working to ensure that the decarbonization work that you all are doing in the building sector is happening equitably and being done without increasing the cost burden on St. Paul residents?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And we're doing this in a few ways. And we are thrilled about the work that Minneapolis has been doing for a while, because it's really kind of paved the way for us to think about some similar opportunities. One way is through our sustainable building ordinance that we've had in place in St. Paul for a dozen years, where any project receiving over $200,000 of public funds, and that's typically going to be affordable housing projects in the multifamily sector, has to meet a higher standard for kind of building and energy than current building code. And so we've had 65 plus buildings come through that program over that dozen years. And again, that's a lot of those buildings are multifamily affordable projects receiving tax credits or some other form of public subsidy. And the good news there is that the residents of those buildings are experiencing lower utility bills than they would have otherwise. And then we're really looking to focus new and additional resources in this area of low income weatherization, efficiency, and pre-weatherization, the very thing that Kim was talking about, these homes that have some other challenge, such as the ones that Kim mentioned, or mold or a leaky roof that don't allow weatherization dollars to come into the home. And so we're looking at using some of the city's American Rescue Plan funds to fill that gap for the next few years with a new program targeting the homes of our lowest income residents. And finally, we've got, we're just over a year into having our Climate Justice Advisory Board in place. And really the role of the CJAB is to help ensure that the city is designing programs equitably and to make sure that we're avoiding some of those challenges that could otherwise arise if we weren't thinking really clearly and carefully about the impacts of our programs and policies. One last thing is that we're looking at a new pilot working with Excel that would target electrically heated homes in some of our lowest income neighborhoods and switching some of those homes over to electric heat pumps, lowering utility bills considerably. In many cases, those are some of the highest bills that people in St. Paul are experiencing.
Well, thanks, Russ. I want to pivot back a little bit to Representative Long for a moment. There does seem to be consensus around the legislature around housing affordability as a goal and a problem that needs to be addressed. But there's not, at least to my knowledge, a lot of consensus yet around exactly what the best strategies and solutions are. And so my question for you, Representative, is what kind of resources or support do you need and your colleagues need from folks like the folks that are watching this webinar from the affordable housing community in order to drive consensus with legislators from different parties and maybe different regions of the state?
Well, it's a good question. So we, as folks well know, have a fair bit of money to work with this year. We have a $9 billion surplus plus $1 billion or so in ARPA money. And so we need to figure out how to prioritize spending that. And that means that we need to hear from stakeholders about what their priorities are. And I think that the beauty of this conversation that we're having today is there are some really important and powerful stakeholders in the affordable housing community and some important and powerful stakeholders in the clean energy affordability community. And if we work together, then I think we can have a combined bigger voice at the Capitol about how we want to prioritize some of the spending and making sure that the investments in affordable housing are also taking into account the full cost of housing, which includes energy, and also trying to make sure that our housing stock is as efficient and comfortable and healthy as we can. So I think that our combined efforts are important, and I think it's important for folks in this call not just to be talking to folks who you think need persuading, but also talking to people who agree with you, because when we're making prioritization decisions, like on the state budget question, we need to figure out what the biggest priorities are, and in part we do that by listening to stakeholders and listening to the public and listening to constituents. So that's why it's important for you all to be weighing in. And I think when we're talking about weatherization in particular, there's opportunities for single family, but also for multifamily housing. So if we can expand some of that funding, I think that can make some real potential for not only dealing with new construction, like with the building codes we talked about, but also some of our existing buildings and making sure we're getting funding there.
Great. So coming back to you, Kim, the Better Building Code report noted that co-benefits such as things like resident health, quality of life improvements are important to quantify in order to fully understand.
Yeah, but I thought that they were serious.
impacts of a policy like a better building
I
code?
gave a really serious and thoughtful response.
If folks could mute, please, that would be great. In order to fully understand the impacts of a policy like a better building code. How do you measure or evaluate co-benefits from housing and building policy changes in the work that you're doing in Minneapolis, and how can we do this perhaps better? Oh, and Kim, you're muted.
Right. It's a good question. It's a challenging question. It's very hard to measure some of the indirect benefits of the higher quality housing, but a couple of ideas that I had just real quickly is one, we have the concept of the social cost of carbon, which really talks about and measures or values what the negative externalities are when emitting carbon. We can also look at that in the inverse, in which we look at like, this is also a value, a monetary value that is a benefit to a building when we have lower carbon solutions implemented in the new construction or in the renovation. So I'd really like to see how we can apply a social cost of carbon to maybe a social cost of equity or a social cost of health, where we'd be able to adopt that and measure the sort of components that would make up that overall number. The other thing that we look at is, which we use currently when we're looking at our racial equity impact analysis, which we did draft or help draft for this particular report. So we're really looking at things within the racial equity impact analysis that identifies where we have high incidence of asthma, where we're seeing incidences of high lead exposure. And so looking at ways that we can develop either proxies for community health around either number of cases of asthma, number of hospital visits as a result of lung or asthma issues. Those can be proxies for how we are doing. So if we're seeing a reduction in that or an improvement in community health as a result of really focusing on, in our case, green zone communities, our environmental justice communities where we're doing home improvements over at least a longer period of time, I think that's where we would like to see movement, because ultimately that's where we want to see folks achieving healthy outcomes. And so those are a couple of ideas that I had, but again, it's certainly an open question about how we can measure those particular outcomes that are sort of indirect from these housing policies.
Great, and we're kind of running up on time here, so I'm going to throw the last question to Russ. Russ, what kind of following up on this conversation, what differences, if any, are there that you have experienced between the work of decarbonizing affordable homes versus market rate homes? And how can we design policy that targets incentives to support affordable housing goals along with decarbonization?
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I understand we're bumping up against time here. I think the main issue here is that balancing act between who's paying the upfront cost for different energy systems or improvements in energy efficiency and decarbonization, who's getting those benefits. And those two things tend to be a little bit different if you're talking about market rate housing development versus subsidized affordable housing development, where with the subsidized affordable, typically a developer is going to own and hold that property for a long period of time. Most of those developers are nonprofits interested in more than just the development of the building itself. And sometimes what we see is a gap between the 6 or 7 year payback that private investors are looking for in market rate development and the longer payback for some of these energy systems. And I think Chris was sort of hinting at some of those things in his comments. And so I do think that there are opportunities to bridge those gaps, and that the Better Building Code is one way to do that. But we're going to have to be really cognizant, as Chris said, of those older buildings as they come up for opportunities to be converted, or not converted, but to be upgraded and to be improved, and opportunities to maintain the affordability in some of those buildings while making these energy upgrades.
Well, that's a great note to end on. I want to thank, we're at time, unfortunately. I want to thank our panelists, Representative Long, Kim Havey, and Russ Stark, and hand the microphone back to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much. And we are a little over time, so I think I'll just bring us to a close, say thank you again to both of our panels of speakers, as well as our research manager, Gabriela at Norton. I will note there were a few comments in the chat I was going to highlight, but I think we're a little bit out of time. So we will send out some materials and recording of this session to all the participants and host it on our website as well, so that you can take a little deeper dive, since this was kind of a whirlwind tour of the Better Building Code report. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.